Hi, welcome to our session about email etiquette. First and foremost, I want to welcome you here, and I'm going to tell you who I am. My name is KarenIvy, and I work here at UTSA in the University Career Center. And my position title is Assistant Director of Student Services. Today we're going to really focus in on what to do and what not to do with regard to technical communication. This, as you may know, has become a very popular conversation. It's a good one to have because many people are making very easy to correct or easy to fix mistakes. And if you know it on the front end, I hope to prevent you from making some of these once you get into a professional work setting. We'll start by talking a little bit about the objectives for today. But first, before we get to that, I want to show you a sample email message. Take a few minutes, take a look at what's written out here, and I want to give you some time to see if you can make sense of this. And this is written from a supervisee to a supervisor. All right, I've given you just a few seconds, but that should be good enough. I want you to hopefully respond back and tell me what you see here. For many of you, puzzled faces are typically what is seen when you see a work email like this. As you go through this, it almost feels like translating from one language to another, right? This is really text language. This has become really commonplace. While this can be absolutely appropriate from friend to friend or in a non-professional workplace, and there may be many of you who looked at this and translated it perfectly and easily, this is not something that you want to happen in a workplace setting or in a professional setting of any kind. Sending an email like this to a professor would also be very difficult. In fact, I would assume that many of them would just delete automatically and not take time to try to figure out what all these symbols and shortened words, what they really mean. If you're curious about what was really emailed here, this is the actual email, and you can see a website there. It actually takes typical conversation with proper sentence structure, and it will translate it into what we might know as text language. All too often we have students who are turning in formal papers, who are emailing, communicating of any type in that common language, that commonly used language that's out there either through cell phone or other means of communication, but that is not okay when it comes to your professional etiquette. What we're going to talk about today is going to hopefully keep you from making these mistakes. We do all interact with the printed word as if it does have a living personality. So as soon as you read an email or any kind of communication, I guarantee that most of us read it with that person in mind. You may even hear that person's voice as you read through that information. It does make either a positive or a negative impression. And so it's crucial as you start your career in the field that you're studying right now that you start out making the connections you want to with that really positive impression and professional impression. All right, and just a comic for you. All right, so elements of email etiquette we're going to focus on today, and the main focus will be email, as that is the most common practice for technical communication between two various professionals, either of the same level or ranking, so to speak, or between a supervisee and a supervisor. So things that we're going to look at today is a general format of technical communication and what it should look like. In addition to that, tone. Just as having a conversation from person to person and your tone impacting how people understand what you're saying, it does impact when you write an email in a very similar manner. Also, grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes, you can't have a talk about this without touching on that because it is very, very important as well. Message length, attachments, making the choice on what to attach and what not and how to do so, and then the cursive surprises. So by the end of this presentation, I hope you feel like you have a pretty good overview of what issues that you may need to correct or things that you'll want to avoid in the future. All right. What makes email different? Email is a form of communication. In this case, we're talking about professional communication. As you can see from the cartoon, and it states, no one really knows who it's coming from. so to speak. If they don't know you, if you're reaching out to someone who's never met you, a lot is going to be gleaned from what you have in that email. For them to try to piece together, who is this person who's reaching out to me? What do they want from me? What is their motivation, and who are they in respect to who I am? And so you can see the two dogs here on the screen. Obviously, whoever they're writing to is not going to know exactly who they are. So some general policies, that's where we probably need to start. When you receive a professional email that is not abrupt and is not carelessly written, you're doing everything correctly. Email is an easy way for people to communicate. It's fast, and most people rely on this to do all sorts of business at this point. So you can't get around it. Some basic tips you need to be aware of is that it is important to write a clear subject line. You can see an example here. It actually references the class title and the time frame, and then a little bit about the question's subject matter. If you have a specific question like that, this is a great format to utilize. That way, when that person, let's say they can't get to that email right away, but maybe they open it up briefly, as they peruse back through their email at a different time when they're scrolling through to maybe follow up on questions and messages, it'll be easy for them to think back and remember what exactly the content was from that email, and you get a better response rate when you do this. In addition to having a clear subject line, make sure your salutation is also professional. If you're addressing a professor, make sure you call them doctor and use their last name. Most of them have their doctorate unless they're a lecturer, but make sure you know what their title is so that you are able to appropriately greet them in this email. Make sure the email is brief. Email is not meant for having a long, personalized conversation. It's meant to be a fairly brief form of communication. If you have multiple objectives, it's not recommended, but there are ways that you can do an email that does touch on various subjects. Typically, you need to keep it brief. If it's more than one screen's length, you've really probably done too much discussion. If you cannot get to the point of what you need to communicate with this person in just that amount of page, it's probably advisable that you try to reach them on the phone, reach them in person, so that you can communicate all the very important points that you have to say. Make sure you do check punctuation, check spelling, grammar errors. This is no different than other professional work that you may turn into someone. You know, as you look at resumes, for instance, we all know, or at least in the Career Center world, we know how crucial it is to make sure it's a perfect example of work. Same really goes for email, and we'll talk later about how much that impacts the impression you make on someone else. Also, be aware of fonts. Many fonts are difficult to read, so you want to make sure it's fairly conservative, neutral in the way that it looks. Typical fonts that we recommend, just because they've been proven through research that they're a little bit easier on the eyes, are the fonts Arial, Times New Roman, Calibri, maybe Cambria. It's a little bit more fancy, but if you keep it to the ones that have a more conservative look, it will be easier to the person who's receiving it to read through it more quickly, and that's to your advantage. Additionally, this is a huge one, and I see this often in my experience of working with students or even colleagues, is that many times there's not a closing, there's not a name. In particular, I think I see it more with their undergraduate students, but just be aware of this. If all I know about you when I get an email is your email address, such as skiguy01@yahoo, I may not know what email connects to what person, obviously, and too many people just write a quick couple statements and don't do any sort of address or closing statement or name. And so it makes it a lot harder to reference or put together who's asking what. The answer to the question might be different depending on who's writing the email. Be careful with caps. Many times, and you may well know this is pretty well understood, but when you do capitalize, it is indicating a certain tone. And so if you see an email that's written in all caps, you can consider that an email that is loud in tone. It's either screaming or raising a voice. So be aware of that. Like we mentioned earlier, text messaging, that type of language has become very commonplace, but it's inappropriate in any sort of professional conversation through email. And then last but not least, make sure that make sure the text in your email is formatted for the receiver. Many times plain text may be the way to go so that you know it won't be transformed or hard for them to read. And it may do it on its own, but be aware of what type of format is available through that company or that culture of that organization, especially if it's within the same company or organization that you're speaking with someone. All right. Moving from the general format, we'll look at a couple subject lines just for some examples. This is an example that you can see: marketing meeting rescheduled, and then a date is given. Good use of to the point, pretty concise and obvious subject matter with regard to the subject line. Also be aware that the blind carbon copy, many times you might notice some of these acronyms as you type in your email. At the very top you'll have two. Typically you have a carbon copy where you can include others that need to know maybe the communication that's happening between you and the other person or persons. In addition, at the very bottom, typically you'll see a blind carbon copy where you can add in other people. It has been shown over and over that this builds quite a bit of distrust within the organization. It may even be a very positive email. If it is, and it's something that maybe a supervisor also needs to know about, go ahead and carbon copy them in that section of the email so that other person can see that the boss, the supervisor, is aware. But as soon as you start adding people in a blind carbon copy, it's almost like letting them in to see a letter that you received in the mail or personal information, and you can do a lot of damage between your relationships with other colleagues in your organization. Right. In addition, in general format, be aware of character spacing. Most computers at this point are going to do a lot of this for you, but if you do, and you may get some emails that are like this where you actually have to scroll across the screen to see every line. Typically it's about 65 characters or less that is going to fill the width of a screen. So if your text looks like it is kind of going across the screen quite a bit, maybe do some looking into how to change those settings. And then if it's going to be forwarded, you definitely want to keep it to a minimum just for the ease of the reader. A lot of people typically have questions about what kind of greeting should you use. It can depend. The opinions are fairly divided about this. A lot of times if you just start with a "Hi Steve" or "Hi Mary," it can be seen as a bit informal if it's a professional email. If you say "to whom it may concern," that's a bit of a more professional air to it, but it may come across as a little bit removed and stiff. And so you want to go somewhere in the middle. Typically for external communication, you could say "dear" and include the name, just what you would normally see in any type of letter. For more internal communication, so someone that you already know, that you have rapport with, it's good just to go with the first name. As you start building your email, the body of the email would come next. Before we even get into the anatomy of that, make sure you're reviewing and deleting and editing emails. The one thing that is different about verbal communication, having an open conversation with someone, is that emails don't go away. Even if you delete them, if you recall them, damage can be done that you really don't have a lot of control over. So make sure that you look at what you're actually saying in that email. And if that email was to be brought to someone maybe in a position of leadership, make sure that that wouldn't be something, if shared, that you'd be really embarrassed about, that you would feel was inappropriate to be shared with other staff members or colleagues or professional networking contacts that you have. So things that you do want to avoid, if you see any of this, know that you want to make some addition or edits, that you want to change things, that you want to add other things to clarify, but you don't want to send any type of email that has any negative comments about management. You don't want to send any emails that criticizes staff or discusses performance issues. Those are better left in a one-to-one conversation that you can have person to person. Bonuses and salary issues, that also is inappropriate for an email. product or liability issues, gossip of any kind. While I would not recommend engaging in gossip in an office or a professional setting of any sort, you certainly don't want to do so over email. Again, these things can just be forwarded so easily, and you have to think about, do you want to be responsible for causing rifts between colleagues? That's a huge, you can get fired for some of that. So keep that in mind. Know that that's a huge professional issue that I would recommend staying very far away from. And then there can be an issue with humor and other ambiguous topics. So something you may think is funny, try to read it from the perspective of other people. If it could be misinterpreted, go ahead and delete it. Save the potential of being a really funny guy or funny girl in the office. I'm sure you might have saved a laugh from a colleague that they really needed. But if it could be misread, it can be very damaging not only to your career or your professional image, but also to that organization as a whole. We'll talk about this a bit more. As I mentioned, there are a few times where a longer email is okay. You may have something you want to send out to your entire staff that talks about some major objectives that are coming down. Or you may have some colleagues that need to know some of your initial thoughts about a project. If you can, try to use lists or bullet points so that it's a bit easier for them to go through. If they only have 5 minutes but they want to get a sense of what you're talking about, having this bulleted point list or numbered points of importance will give them some context to kind of get a sense of your main objective in writing them to begin with. There's a couple of examples that you can see. So again, it's not recommended for something formal like this, but this may be your only option, and so keep these in mind and make it easier on your reader. Additionally, when you're closing your email, you want to match your tone with the greeting that you had. So if you said, "Dear Dr. Perez," then match it with a "sincerely," a "best regards, cordially." If it's more informal, "Thanks, all the best." You can see several options here. Just make sure that it's consistent, that your tone stays the same. And then it's advisable to use a signature line. You'll notice this with most professionals, that they have their name and their contact information built in. And most email products, as you probably know, have a way to just have a signature line that automatically is entered into your email before you even start writing. This helps them if they need to contact you. It gives them all the information so easily for them to grab or get or use to call you. PS, which is short for postscript, so adding a little tagline or a little thought at the bottom is actually not recommended. If you have something that's important enough to be in an email, use it, go back, reformat it in the body of the email. Many times those are missed anyway, so I would recommend staying away from that. Now moving on to tone. As we mentioned before, you've written in this email, your tone can be expressed through written word. So as you start looking at the way you've structured your sentences, the language that you use, make sure it doesn't sound too terse. Read your emails aloud if you need to. Sometimes that gives you a better sense of how it's going to sound to the person who gets that email. There's even, as you can see, some products out there, some that are free, some that are not free, that do a tone check on your communication. Just know that it is available to you. If you don't want to get into that sort of technology to check it, another option is if it doesn't contain confidential information, you can have a colleague or a trusted associate, another student that you trust, to look over it and see if they read it and have a certain perception that you wouldn't want to communicate. All right. Nonverbal cues account for a certain percentage of any message. You can take a guess here, start thinking of numbers in your head, but I'll go ahead and give you the answer. It's well over half. So 65% of any communication happening in an email message is gained from nonverbal cues. That's huge, especially when we start talking about written statements. So be aware. People tend to read between the lines quite a bit. All right, a few facts from some common mistakes, some mistakes that have been made. There's been a study, it's a formal study that's been done both in Germany and Britain. I'm unaware if there's anything that's been done that's comparable in the U.S. It's probably true, but this is a well-published article that does look at confrontations that have been had because of misunderstandings that have happened because of email. And so as we start looking at professionals, their communication with colleagues, it's upwards of, let me get to it, 23% for Germany, and 14% of all email communication that has resulted in a confrontation. So again, this is happening and it's pretty widespread. Be sure you do what you need to do to check your tone, to check what you're saying. Participants also in some recent studies, they looked to see how well someone was able to communicate something humorous or something sarcastic. And accurately, only a little over half. That's concerning as well. So again, remember, people are not just reading the words that you write. They're looking to see what your intentions are. They're making some assumptions about where you're coming from that may or may not be right and accurate. All right, I have an example for you as well, just to show you the seriousness of what this can mean. There was a company well known who was forced to pay $2.2 million settling a harassment case, and it was based on a forward. It was a humorous joke email, and it was entitled "Why Beer is Better Than Women." Well, many of the women associates in that corporation felt that it was degrading to them. And so because of this and the misinterpretation, they've got a huge lawsuit on their hand. Think about being the person that initially forwarded this message or sent it along to colleagues, knowing that you've cost the company this much money. I would probably guess that person is no longer working for that organization. But again, how devastating to lose your career, your place in that organization based on a quick forwarded email that was not really well thought out. All right, couple of tones here. I've got an example of a dress code email that's sent out. Take a moment to read through what it says here. And take it in as if you're receiving this from your supervisor. What would your initial emotional response be? It may or may not elicit some emotions from you. If we take a look and compare it to this next email, I'll take a few minutes to let you look at this. You may have a different response to it. Think about ways to restructure sentences, especially through email, that will come across clear and concise, and it's okay for it to be directive. I'm assuming this is coming from a supervisor, and so that's expected, but make sure that you are careful about how you structure that, maybe to just prevent some misunderstandings or negative emotional reactions. All right. When your email is meant to address concerns, most of the time it's best to discuss those in person. If you don't have that option, if you don't have that luxury, you can make sure it's done in a timely manner. And then watch how your language is structured. So if you have an email and it says, "Why did I get this task?" and you can see several question marks here, that is definitely going to elicit maybe a whining tone, an angry tone. That's not what you want to portray to someone who maybe has some say in your professional development or where you're going from where you're at with regard to your job. All right, other tone issues. Flaming is a virtual term. You can see the definition there. That is when you have something that's pretty inflammatory. There's a lot of emotion that's negative that's behind the message. And there can be a lot of kind of back and forth bickering that can get out of control very quickly. And so I think flaming is a good term. It spreads like wildfire. It's so much easier to have those type of conversations. And they become less inflammatory when happening in person. When you have it in email, again, it's something that it's right there in black and white, and you can't necessarily take back some of what you said. It'll be there to resurface at any time. And then a few kind of quick tips or things to think about. And I think most of these we've addressed. Make sure you read and reread. Make sure you're not writing in a state where you know you're pretty emotional about something. Most of the time that leads to feeling pretty dissatisfied with it later, and really regretting maybe some things that you said or the ways that you said it. Alright, if you happen to be on the receiving side of an email addressed to you that's like this, make sure that you don't egg it on, that you don't fan the flame, so to speak. So take a look at some of the tips here. Make sure that if possible you're the more professional in the situation. It'll end up being to your advantage in the end of everything. So apologize if you need to. Don't get bogged down by details. Thank them if you feel led to for bringing the matter to your attention, but address it in a calm tone, just as you would in a regular face-to-face conversation. Make sure that, again, that you're not helping this thing spiral into something very detrimental. All right. And again, as mentioned, make sure if you can talk to someone in person that you do. Alright, on to grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes. You can see the big number kind of jump out at you there, the first stat. So 81% of a survey sample said they had negative feelings toward the email sender when there was bad grammar, misspelling, or disconnected arguments. 81%. So that's a huge percentage that, again, is impacting the professional image that you have. 41% of senior managers said that even badly worded emails did make them think of their supervisees as more lazy, disrespectful, and many negative other adjectives that you can think of. So this is crucial to keep in mind. All right. Here's an actual email. This is just one that was pulled from the internet. Hopefully there's several problems with this that you notice. If you don't, I would recommend using spell check of some sort, because there's a lot of problems with the punctuation, with spelling, grammar. Again, this is not going to be a very good impression made if this was actually to be sent out. All right. Back to length of message. We do want to spend a little bit of time today on this. If you are going to send a long message, again, we talked about bullet points and lists, but make sure that you do warn the reader. That way, if they don't have very much time at that point, they can wait until they have more of a long time frame set aside to address what you have to say. Create a summary, use headings for major sections, but again, this is only few and far between when you should be in a situation where you use this method. All right. And lastly, don't wait until the last minute to spring something on your supervisor. If you have something that you need from them, if you need to take off, if you have a question, a really important question before a big meeting or maybe a project proposal, it's a really bad idea, especially if it's last minute, to address this problem via email. Most definitely, you want to try to avoid that at all costs, but if it is a last minute concern or need that you have in person, is the only way to go. Make sure as they come across, as you note certain problems or issues that are arising, that you do address them immediately. Timeliness is crucial. And then, again, make sure that you carve out time to address these. Why is netiquette another word for what we've been talking about today? Why is it so important? We know that with regard to your advancement in your career, whether you've already secured the job that you want or you're not quite there yet, making connections, building relationships with others who have similar interests to you is crucial. It's crucial for you getting a job. It's crucial for you connecting with the right people, becoming a leader in your field, getting promoted. All of it hinges to who you know and how you treat these people. And so you can see here an illustration, but it's truly the easiest way to connect with people across country, across the world. Everything is very global. And so the way that you interact with people through technology is definitely going to have a strong impact on where you end up being in your career in the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. consider it an important thing to invest some time in. And if any of the things really resonated with you that we've talked about today, come in and have a chat with one of us if you are finding that you're getting a negative response to emails that you send out. Talk with your supervisor, chat with us. We'd love to try to help you improve or note some things that you could do to maybe come across in a way that you're hoping to come across to build better relationships and better rapport. And this concludes the presentation on technical etiquette, particularly regarding your email. If you have any questions for us or for me, you can feel free to follow up with us. Our email address, my email address is listed, as well as a phone number to connect. If you'd like to sit down and make an appointment to discuss this or any other career-related topics, it's given here, and you can do this at your convenience. You can also explore our website, which is given at the bottom, hireroadrunners.com. Feel free to go in and click around. We have a lot of resources that we feel would be helpful to you, to include articles, short video clips, and other tools and resources that are interactive that we hope will help you advance in your career field of choice. Thank you very much.